Kia ora koutou, everybody. Thanks for having me on today to talk about what is a bit of a hot topic at the moment, as well as for many people as well, a sensitive issue, as I'm sure a lot of you have perhaps encountered. I think, as Vic noted, it is an area of growing interest, particularly in the employment field, because there are and remains to be questions about the extent to which vaccines can be mandated, and different views on that as well, including within the employment law industry as well. But what I thought would be helpful today is to start off by providing a framework for, the legal framework for what the obligations are of employers around protecting their staff and how that feeds into COVID and vaccines and taking those steps to protect your staff, as well as addressing the human rights issues as well that no doubt will arise, particularly if you are requiring your staff or at least requesting particular staff members to be vaccinated. So firstly, the starting point is that employers are all bound by the Health and Safety at Work Act, which means that you have to take reasonably practicable steps to ensure, or as far as you can, that you are minimising or eliminating the risks of harm to your staff. So in the COVID environment, that's going to include, for example, where someone is going into a high-risk environment where there is either vulnerable people or they will have a high risk of exposure, what steps you're taking to protect those staff members. So that is the starting point in the framework in which employers have to consider either if they are obliged to vaccinate their staff, or at least consider which roles may be subject to potential vaccination. In terms of the issues that will arise, before I get to the practical side of mandating vaccines and how you would go about doing that, the issues that can arise are where employees, for example, refuse to be vaccinated or say that they are unable to be vaccinated for particular reasons covered by the Human Rights Act. And without going into an exhaustive list of what those reasons could be, the most common in our experience are the religious belief. So someone has a religious belief that in their view or in somebody else's view, it could be the view of their church, means that they cannot be vaccinated. So that's one reason which could be covered by the Human Rights Act. The other, which is the more common reason, is someone has a health condition which actually prevents them from being vaccinated, and they've got a medical certificate or a note from their doctor saying that they can't be vaccinated. Now, in those circumstances, any decision, be it vaccination or any decision that may, in respect of an employee's employment, where their reason for refusing vaccinations falls into those categories, you have to consider the extent to which you may be discriminating against them based on that condition. And so where that is the case, so where someone has a health condition or a religious belief, and that is the basis for not being vaccinated, it requires additional steps to be taken in considering whether or not you can accommodate that employee, and the test is if it's without unreasonable disruption. So it does not mean, and it's often I think a misunderstanding amongst a lot of people, that you cannot require. It doesn't mean you can't require the employee to be vaccinated. What it means is that there is an additional consideration as to whether or not there are options you can or avenues that you can take with that employee, which allows them to continue to be employed, that doesn't actually disrupt the business that you are performing. So that's the sort of legal framework in which the questions around vaccinations have been debated and answered. Now, I'm sure the burning question for a lot of people is, can you require your employees to be vaccinated? before I discuss other options like encouraging. Obviously, there are all other, options that employers can consider without, perhaps being as heavy-handed as requiring them to be vaccinated. But let's talk about a requirement to be vaccinated. So in terms of the test or the process for requiring vaccinations, the first step that an employer would have to take is understanding, firstly, which roles are the ones which, according to the risk of the role, cannot be undertaken by an unvaccinated worker. And the question relating to that, in establishing whether or not the role can be undertaken by an unvaccinated worker would have to be answered by undertaking a risk assessment, ideally undertaken by a medical professional, an epidemiologist, or someone, a public health specialist who can say, this role is, for these reasons, likely to have an increased risk of exposure to COVID-19, or we'll be dealing with vulnerable people, and therefore these people are, for example, immunocompromised, and therefore individuals in those roles, it's our obligation under the Health and Safety at Work Act to take steps to ensure that that individual is vaccinated. And that may mean implementing a policy requiring that employee to be vaccinated, or at the least asking them to be vaccinated and providing them with the risk assessment. WorkSafe has come out now and also confirmed that employers can require vaccination subject to undertaking that risk assessment of those roles. So that's the key step, is showing the health advice or the steps that have been taken in establishing or justifying why you are now requiring that role to be vaccinated. Now, in terms of my sort of layman's view of the sort of environments, I guess your employees will be working in, the risk factors will be, for example, heavily dense environments. If they're going into environments where social distancing is going to be difficult, or there may be a higher risk of exposure for whatever reason, there has to be contact with particular individuals, well, then that sort of factor is going to go towards justification for requiring those roles to be vaccinated. So that's step one, is saying we've undertaken a risk assessment, and the risk assessment has established that this role should be undertaken by a vaccinated worker. Now, once you've implemented that, or you've said that to your employees, after following a process and consulting them ideally, the next step is those employees who say, well, I either don't want to be vaccinated because I consider it my personal choice, or the alternative that they can't be vaccinated because they have a condition that prevents them from being vaccinated. How you address those employees, because you've got a risk assessment saying it needs to be undertaken by a vaccinated worker. So what do you do with the employees who say they can't be vaccinated or they won't be vaccinated? And without, obviously, I can't provide you with the answer for every case, because it has to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis based on the reasons for refusal. But the process will generally about firstly considering whether or not you can accommodate that employee and what options you could consider. And that's where you might consider, for example, redeploying them to another part of the business, such as if there is an office role that they can undertake which doesn't require vaccination, proposing that to the employee. Or if it's the risk assessment, for example, says it's only during alert level 2 or alert level 3 that we believe vaccinations are required. One option might be saying, until we go to alert level 2 or alert level 1, or whichever alert level, it's established vaccines aren't required, you're going to be on leave with pay. That could be a reasonable option that the authority or the courts might consider. The employer at least has to consider and propose to the employee. So to sort of summarize that process, the justification for requiring vaccination is the first step, and showing the evidence as to why you're requiring it. And the next step is saying to the employee, this is what we've established. Now, are you willing to get vaccinated? And if not, these are the options available to you. If you have an employee then who refuses all of those options, or if you can't accommodate the employee, there are no other roles that they can be redeployed into. The last resort is that the employee could face dismissal, subject to that dismissal being justified, and that would be based on the process that you've followed and the sort of justification, and that's when you would go back to the risk assessment and show that you've conducted this robust process to ensure that you've been able to justify why that role can only be undertaken by a vaccinated worker. So that is the process in a nutshell. I know it's probably not necessarily going to be the easiest process to follow, particularly given the emotions that for particularly workers who refuse to be vaccinated will always be a part of that. But it is what in New Zealand has been the approach taken by other employers, and now with WorkSafe coming out in support is the I think pretty well established that that is available in New Zealand. There isn't a whole lot of case law, so it is still an untested area in New Zealand. So it's not to say that the process is going to be without risk. But in Australia, they've got cases where, for example, early childhood centres have been able to implement vaccine mandates just because of the additional risk factors that existed in those environments. And after the employer had consulted with their employees and introduced a policy requiring vaccinations, it was challenged, and the federal court in Australia upheld that. So it's likely that there will be a case in New Zealand that discusses mandatory vaccines, and I think, judging by previous case law around other policies like drug and alcohol policies are similar in terms of the invasiveness of those procedures, but the ability of employers to implement those policies, the courts are likely to take a similar approach in allowing those sort of policies to be implemented. So yeah, that's the sort of process in a nutshell, but I'm happy to answer questions because I'm sure there are some specific questions that people have which I may be able to provide some guidance on.
Can I just, it's Anita here from Comcare Trust.
A
couple of quick questions.
Yeah.
One is that you're referring to the health and safety policies of, your responsibility as an employer. There's, I guess, because we have health contracts and we provide services to people who experience mental illness and they're health funded. Is there any idea that I guess, because of the safety of the clients, because being vaccinated and wearing masks and others is about their safety as well? So it could be mandated in that way.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and that's where the justification, for example, for a vaccination policy can refer to, for example, if you're a regulated profession, like there is some healthcare professions are regulated by the Health and Disability Commission, where there are obligations to ensure the safety of patients or the safety of residents. Those sort of obligations are going to be part of that justification for requiring vaccinations. As you say, it's not just about protecting your own workforce. You would also refer to the fact that as a, for example, a community housing provider, we also have obligations to the residents to ensure that we don't employ staff or send staff into your home that are unvaccinated and put you at risk.
Yeah. The other quick question was, there are health records are private, obviously, and fall under the Privacy Act. What if you had a employee who said, yes, I'm vaccinated, but no, I'm not willing to present proof of that. That's my private health record.
Yeah, it's another good question, and one which for, again, it's similar to the vaccine question and requiring vaccines. And requiring vaccines, you would also justify why you're requiring employees to disclose their vaccine status and provide evidence to support that. As you say, someone might say, I'm been vaccinated, but how can you ensure that that's true? So in justifying requiring them to disclose their vaccine status and provide a note from their doctor or whatever evidence may be satisfactory, you would be justifying that on the basis of needing to know their vaccine status in order to, because them being vaccinated is required for them to perform the role.
I guess
So
like a driver's license that you can ask proof. They can say I've got a driver's license, but you need proof.
exactly, yeah. So because you're required to take reasonably practicable steps to ensure the safety of not just them and their colleagues, but also as you raised the question of the residents as well. You would say it's a lawful and reasonable instruction to your employee to require them to disclose evidence that they've been vaccinated, and if they refuse, well, then there are options such as you could redeploy them, or alternatively consider dismissal and follow a process in that respect.
Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Kia ora, it's Fiona here from Link People. I just had a question around the reason for not wanting to be vaccinated.
Yep.
And whether that matters. Just going back, I heard you say that if it's something like a medical certificate or a religious belief, that would hold more weight than someone just saying, I don't want to be.
Yeah.
In terms of a legal process that might then unfold and whether you've breached their human rights.
Yeah. So that's a good question. So the reason is relevant, of course, and as part of a process. For example, if an employee, say you've done a risk assessment and you've established that the role has to be performed by a vaccinated worker, they refuse, you would then commence a process to raise their refusal with them and discuss the alternative options, redeployment, dismissal, etc., whatever options could be considered. And as part of that, consider their refusal, the reasons for refusal. The reason why the religious belief or health condition as a reason needs to be considered with more weight is because it's a prohibited ground of discrimination under the Human Rights Act. So because of that, the Human Rights Act sets a test for establishing that you can't discriminate on the basis of those reasons, religious belief or health condition. But there are exceptions. For example, where allowing that person to remain in the workplace would create a significant disruption to your operation. So it doesn't mean you have to allow an unvaccinated worker in employment. You don't have to allow them to remain in employment. If you can establish that allowing them to remain in employment would cause significant disruption to your business, you can still commence a process which may end in that employee's dismissal. But it's a question where, for example, you have 20 employees who have refused vaccination. 10 of them have said, it's a personal choice, and you've got 10 who have a legitimate reason. I think there is an argument there that the people who have a legitimate reason, like, one covered by the Human Rights Act, should really be prioritised for redeployment opportunities, because the bar is higher for accommodating them, because it's, there is the threshold in the Human Rights Act. Yeah. Any other questions?
Good Barnaby. Sorry, it's Paul here from Salvation Army. Really interesting, and thank you for your time. I think us as providers need to seek some real clear and clarification from our organisations around how and what they're going to be doing moving forward. No doubt, there's something work going on higher up. So thank you for that. And the other thing I think raises for me is, do we as providers also need to start thinking about, as far as the referrals and people we take in, and this is probably not a question for you, Barnaby, but for providers, about whether we have to start asking clients if they're vaccinated, and if we're saying that we have to protect the clients coming in by asking staff that question, it's almost like we could also be in a position or a discussion around what we do as providers moving forward around asking that question of our clients. And I know that's not something for you to answer, but that just come to me now as you were talking. So thank you for that.
No, you're welcome. I will say one thing, and that is, I was talking about, I really focused on how you vaccinate your current workforce. There is, on the flip side, for new employees. So where you are bringing on new employees, it's easier, because you don't have that existing contractual relationship, to require vaccination as a condition of employment. So when you make that a condition of employment in the letter of offer, for example, or the contract, and the person refuses, doesn't mean they have to be vaccinated, but their refusal just simply means that they wouldn't be employed. So it's easier for new employees to mandate vaccination simply as a condition of employment than the process that you need to go through for existing employees.
That makes sense. Yeah, that's good information. Thank you.
Barnaby, a question came through on the chat. You had mentioned that there are certain professions or types of organizations engaged in activities where they have some additional requirements. In the housing space, if, say, one of the MSD or HUD in a contract said, we want all your staff to be vaccinated to deliver on this contract, is that something that they could do, and how would that impact?
Yes, so that would feed into that justification for requiring vaccines, and it's similar in some ways, although not at the same level, but it's similar to the COVID order that was implemented by the government. So all of a sudden, a lot of those organisations at the border had an external requirement, a legal requirement that these staff were vaccinated, and therefore, whilst they, there's the customs case, which is the one that came out recently, which is the first case around vaccinations. It talked about that they'd undertaken a risk assessment, but then as soon as the order came in, all of a sudden there was this additional justification because customs was obliged to be vaccinating their employees. So if you did have that contractual requirement, the provider had a contract with a government agency, and that contract required all of the employees in a particular area were vaccinated, that would be, that would form part of your justification, because you would effectively be saying, if you were not vaccinated, we are in breach of our contract, and would risk, either losing the contract or whatever the sanction is, or the outcome is if you were to be in breach of that contract. So it is relevant to the justification. Yeah.
Thank you. So it sounds like for every organization, there really are going to need to sit down and adopt some kinds of policies and procedures around this, especially, I guess, as the organization gets larger, the likelihood, but short of a mandate by government that everyone must be vaccinated, and maybe with some carve outs, that it will be an issue that comes up for any employer and any staff that they need to be informed about.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing now is an environment of heightened risk. So perhaps 6 months ago, the environment was such that COVID, requiring vaccines wouldn't have been justifiable because there was no COVID in the community. Now we have an outbreak in Auckland. The justification is almost at its highest. Well, it's almost as justified now as it might ever be, particularly if there is no Delta in the community, and in 1 month's time, justifying vaccinations may be more difficult. That's not to say you can't still go through a risk assessment and establish, the risk of exposure is still high. But that's a lot of discussions that I've been having as well with clients, is around the fact that, in the past 2 months we've seen, or however long it's been now, it's sort of, time sort of construct now, but, it's the environment has just all of a sudden ramped up in terms of the risk of being infected with COVID, and that's why I think we're now seeing these discussions around mandatory vaccination a lot more than we were previously. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you. Were there any other questions? Yeah. And if folks have something maybe after, you can always email them across or drop them in the chat. Not seeing any hands come up right now. So Barnaby, thank you very much. It must be a busy time for you, just hearing all the nuances and considerations that have to be taken into account. It's certainly a complex issue with very important ramifications to get right.
Yeah. And I think it's we're going to hear a lot more about it, and hopefully there is some clarity that we get from the courts, and perhaps the government will make it a moot point by mandating vaccinations for these organizations.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Barnaby.
You're welcome.
Your time and joining us. And feel free to stay on if you want to listen in, but get some lunch if you can't.
Yeah, I might go get some lunch, but if anyone has any other questions, they can feel free to flick them through or give me a call.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.